Has Harold Bloom ever given an opinion about David Foster Wallace?
Yeah,
Do you know?
I think Harold Bloom said somewhere. Does anyone know the exact words? He basically said that Wallace. He's in the. One thing you may agree. He and Bret Easton Ellis may agree on only one thing. I think he says he's a blowhard. But does anyone remember the exact words?
He said he had no talent at all, I think.
Yeah, that's right. He's exactly right. He said he had no talent at all. And it's interesting because actually, you know, there's a very, very good New York Review of Books article about David called The Panic of Influence. And one thing that the article points out is that David was very, very worried about his, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but he was very, very worried about plagiarism and stealing from the people who went before him, partially because he did rely on them unusually. And one of the texts that he had read with great interest was actually Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence. You know, there's a draft of Infinite Jest. Is there, in the final version of Infinite Jest, is there a chapter ahead that says something about the Father was so much in him? Is that in there? He was something that the Father was so much in him. Anyway, it's a chapter ahead from The Anxiety of Influence, and it appears as one of the chapter heads in Infinite Jest. It must have been cut. I can never remember what was cut. You know, it's in the manuscripts for so long. But, oh, it was a miracle that the Father was so much in him. Is that the Anxiety of Influence? And I think so, something a lot like that. Anyway, and it's something that David cared enough about that he stuck it right into the Jest, which I think buried David, this meta idea that if you're really anxious about somebody's influence, steal from them. Yeah? It's such a comfortable seat. It's a important seat.
Writing a biography seems like it would be just so intimate and strange at the same time. Were there times where you felt like almost uncomfortable with how intimate you were getting with David Foster Wallace?
Yeah, I mean, and you have to add to that the fact that he had died so tragically only a few years before. I mean, this book was like no other effort I've ever done in terms of research and reporting, because, you know, I mean, everybody who I spoke to who knew him was still in grief. I mean, and I, as a reader of David's, was in grief. And so, you know, somehow that had to become the texture of the research. It had become a part of what I was doing. I had to kind of accept that everything I was learning, you know, and everything that I was writing was colored by this, well, really by the sad fact of his death. I mean, there were plenty of things, you know, there were plenty of things. My wife was always my sounding board. There were plenty of things that were so intimate that I found out about David that I did not put in the book. And it's not that I was trying to spare you as the reader. I worried, you know, a book is a reading experience. Even a biography is a reading experience. And although it's also an act of reporting, you know, if you overload it, for instance, I mean, sort of the obvious example would be David and his relationship with women. People would come up and go like, why didn't you put that in? You know, and the fact is, like, I didn't want this book to be David. You know, there's a Kingsley Amis novel called Stanley and the Women. Like, I didn't want this to be David and the Women. Like, you know, this is a writer. This is a person who achieved masterful work. His issues with women were interesting to me partially because they're interesting, because this is human life, and human life is to me always interesting. But also they're interesting because of how they appear in, you know, Infinite Jest. I'll give you an example. David had a propensity for dating women who had young children. There's a moment where he actually, I think, he objects to Sarah Caldwell. She's breastfeeding her baby, and he objects that her breasts have become public property. I mean, not a very attractive moment, but, you know, a true and human moment. There's another more wonderful moment where he says to his friend Mark Costello that babies are celebrities to themselves, which I just love that. You know, like that quality that the very small baby has of being a star. I just thought his observations were always just so wonderful. You know, even these throwaway lines are just so wonderful. But, you know, I didn't want it all to be in there. You know, this book had to be about a creative person. But in that case, you know, if you remember Oren Incandenza in Infinite Jest, those of you read with particular care, he has a fetish for dating young mothers. Well, I mean, you know, that was David's fetish. And, you know, I think one, you get a kind of surprise moment where you say, oh, this came from life. And no matter what anyone says, writers, novelists read biographies too. Like, it is always interesting to see how things are either transmuted or not from life to fiction. You know, we can pretend it's not. We can pretend that, you know, I mean, it's just the first stage of a biography. It's not what you write it for, but there is You know, it's basically it's sort of the crack cocaine moment of biographies. You're, oh, that's amazing. Did you know that he, you know, that David took that scene from his actual experience in Granada House? But more deeply, I mean, what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to show you the formation of the literary sensibility, and it's always interesting when you find that that literary sensibility derives from the person's own life, and you begin to wonder, well, what does it mean actually for Oren Incandenza or for David? What is this? Why would a person have this kind of interest in young mothers? You know, so you begin to get deeper both into the work. I mean, the work of a biography is always to take you to the work of a writer. You know, I love David, but you can write a biography of someone you don't love as long as you love the work. I mean, there's plenty of examples of it. There's biographies, I think, of Robert Frost. That's the famous one where the biographer wound up absolutely detesting Frost. I think someone did a similar one on, who's the guy who wrote Aerosmith?
Sinclair Lewis.
Sinclair Lewis, right? I think didn't somebody write about him and just detest Sinclair Lewis. So, you know, that doesn't actually change, I think, what the reader can get out of the work. Anyway, we all start that begins with the anxiety of influence. And anyway, that's a good enough answer. Yeah.
You must have surveyed tons of uncollected material, the letters, maybe his emails, and also you mentioned a unpublished story. And I wondered, among all that, what would you most like to see, you know, exposure to the wider world?
Well, that's an interesting question. I actually have seen less than you think, because I think there is less than you think. The archives at the University of Texas have drafts of David's material, and they have some of the early drafts of Infinite Jest. And these drafts are incredibly clean, and so are the early drafts of The Pale King, the posthumous novel, the one he never finished. So there's two possibilities. You know, I always really wanted to see David write. I wanted to see David sit down, and you can see this with some writers. You can go into an archive and you can see them build the work of genius. You can see the wrong turns. With David, you only see you see a guy whose first drafts, which are written in this funny little crabbed, forward-looking hand, small. He used to tell a story that he had learned this handwriting in high school because so many kids wanted to cheat off of him that he had to develop a kind of handwriting nobody could read. Yeah, frankly, I think the story's bullshit. But it's a good story, and you know, it may have a kernel of truth to it. But you never will. I don't believe you'll ever find David undressed. I don't think you'll ever find. I think that he was so smart and thought so big and so comprehensively, had that kind of a brain, that he sort of knew what he was writing before he sat down to write it. So what you do see in the drafts is you see a pretty good piece of fiction becoming slightly better. You know, third draft things for most, well, for me, third draft things for me. The letters are really good. There is, as far as I know, you know, and check back with me, there is no significant unpublished fiction that I know of. There is some uncollected fiction, but that's a very different thing. I mean, this story, the Piano and the Pantechnicon, is true apprentice work. I mean, it's just fun. It's a sketch. You know, David put out enough books during his life that he was, you know, there are letters where he says, should I use this story, should I use that story? And he doesn't get to all of them. And it would be nice to have the missing ones collected. But I don't think they're going to radically change how we think of them. We were mentioning emails, and what's interesting is David gets emailing very late. But he does get there, like 2000, 2000, 2004. When he, like 2000, when I was using email, I think most of us using email quite fluidly, David used to still print out emails and then write a long-handed response and then type it into his computer and then send the email back. And now there's an aspect of archness to, you know, David, the great television addict, refusing to become the great internet addict. But I just don't think he was that comfortable with it. And when he begins, and the point I was going to make is, his fear was well-founded, because when David starts emailing, something very beautiful in his letters begins to, it doesn't evaporate, it just isn't there. That necessity to fit your writing into a box and the impersonality of those computer-imprinted letters told on him. And this pure joy, especially, well, I mean, David wrote letters basically when his writing wasn't going well, and as a result, you always have to wonder, and this is true, I think, nearly 99% of all novelists, like, they always complain. Like, when they're writing well, they sure don't waste it on a letter. Like, you're not, you know, you're a hot hand at the blackjack table, you don't go and play crap. So, you know, but still, and these complaint letters, I think, are among, I mean, among the most wonderful, you could put out a volume of David complaining about not writing well, and I think you'd have an extraordinarily interesting book. There is, by the way, his uncollected nonfiction coming out in a month, and that includes that terrific essay he wrote on Roger Federer, and a really interesting early essay he wrote called Fictional Futures and the Conspicuously Young, which to me is his, if you haven't read Derrida, you can't call yourself a writer essay. And he never collected it, because I think it's, what's fascinating and it's worth reading is it doesn't, the David that we know in nonfiction of these pieces where he goes on a cruise ship and so on and so forth, is this kind of slacker, super educated slacker, you know. But the David who's writing nonfiction before that, who hasn't yet found his nonfiction voice, is actually really trying to impress you. And it's a very weird combination. It's worth checking out. I mean, it's just different. And you realize that had David not gone to Granada House, he still would have been an incredibly interesting writer, but I think he would have been an incredibly uncomfortable writer. You'd always feel like it was a, Look Ma No Hands would be, you know, would be his epitaph.